Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Welcome. You see, even the sun has come out today. I think all in tribute to you all and to our guests today. So the sun welcomes you along with all of us. And believe me, it's been a little dreary today, but now the sun is shining and we should all be very happy. I'm glad that you all could be with us today to welcome Rip Rapson back. Rip has been willing to come down here and to fill us in on the saga of Detroit as it has unfolded. And since he was here the last time, it has unfolded in a major way, and he's going to tell us about that and anything else that he'd like to do. But I want to say, Rip Rapson has he's one of the visionaries in the foundation world. And he's demonstrated over and over again. Before going to the Kresge Foundation, I think in 2006, that's when he moved there, he was the head of the foundation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the McKnight Foundation, where he did the same kinds of things there in terms of developing collaboratives of the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, and government, to get things done that were difficult to do. He's not going to talk about that today, but he did that and then moved to the Kresge Foundation. And one of the first things he did after he got to the Kresge Foundation was to commission what's called a grantee perception report on the foundation by the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The grantee perception reports were a major new invention to enable foundations to get some sense of what their grantees thought about them. I mean, it was the first opportunity. Think about foundation accountability. Those of us who write about it say, well, there's not really very much, but there wasn't any before the grantee perception reports came along, and it gave the grantees a chance to speak up and to say what they really thought about them. And the history of the grantee perception reports is really interesting. I'm not going to tell you about that. That's a separate lecture. But in any event, Rip decided that he would have a grantee perception report, the first one done for the Kresge Foundation when he got there. And lo and behold, it was, let's just say, critical. And you could put an adjective in front of the critical if you'd like to do that. But it was critical in the sense that what it said was, I think it was 75% of the grantees said that they thought that the foundation really didn't quite understand what they were doing. Isn't that about, that's about what it was. And so lo and behold, he puts that up on the website of the foundation. At this point, there were virtually no other foundations putting up critical reports on their websites. But he did it, and the consequence has been that many other foundations have followed in his footsteps and said, if we're going to do this, and if it turns out that it's critical, well, so be it. We need to learn from it. And that's what he did. It's also very interesting. He's going to talk a little, I think, I'm not sure what he's going to talk about. I think he's not sure what he's going to talk about either. But in any event, the main reason that I wanted him to come back was because of the grand bargain that was created that helped get Detroit out of bankruptcy and safeguard the pensions of the city workers. And it's an extraordinary thing in many dimensions. I've just finished writing this new book. And one of the sections of the book deals with the emergence of new foundation collaboratives. When I wrote the first book back in 2007, I could name only 5 collaboratives of any kind among foundations. Now there's some 15 to 20 significant ones, and the biggest one that we know about at this point is the collaborative that Rip had such an important role in fostering, along with the Ford Foundation and the Knight Foundation. And indeed, ending up as a percentage of their endowment, the Ford Foundation put in $125 million in that collaborative, the grand bargain one, which in the Ford Foundation's assets somewhere around $14 billion. And you can figure what $125 million is as a percentage of that. The Kresge Foundation put up $100 million with an asset base of $3.5 billion. So, it's an extraordinary, you think about the difference in the percentages in terms of cooperation there. And the Knight Foundation also put up more than they would normally put up, but it isn't in the same league. So the point is this is the guy who is seeing, and as a result of this, not as a result of this, I think partly it's attributable to the fact that he cares about cities, he cares about what's happening to cities. You've all known, long before the Grand Bargain, when he came down here to talk about what he was doing in revitalizing parts of Detroit, in redoing the transportation system, all of those kinds of, working with government, often with the government, the city government against him in some of these things, or at least differing with him in significant ways. It's really an extraordinary story. And so it's an honor to have you back here again today to fill us in about some of the good things, and if there are bad things, I'm not sure there are, good that are happening in Detroit, that have happened to them since we got here, since you were here the last time. So welcome, Rip Rapson.
Wow. Thank you, Joel. I always feel like I should just stop after Joel does these introductions. This is all kind of downhill.
It's all true and not exaggerated.
You're very kind. And I think one of the reasons I may not have a clear-cut script about what to say today is that I've got 3 or 4 people in the audience who actually know more about my foundation than I do. So, I mean, David Dodson has been an advisor to us in sort of the most profound way over the last couple of years, and has really helped shape us. Hodding Carter is one of my heroes. I don't mean to pick on everyone in the audience, but when I first started this business and I wanted to try to connect with someone who actually knew what it meant to be involved in public policy and to skate through all of the complexity of how institutions become more effective and optimize their work, Hodding was my hero and continues to be. And then I actually have 2 employees of the Kresge Foundation, so if things get really tough, I'm going to ask Napoleon to take over. Napoleon Wallace, who is a Raleigh-Durham native, right? We've had you all of what, 2 weeks? Yeah, 2 weeks in our social finance practice, and Leslie was with us this summer, and we're looking for any possible conceivable way to get her back to Kresge. So we need to talk afterward. So I'm delighted you're here. But anyway. Let me just maybe pivot off of what Joel said about the Grand Bargain to sort of set the stage for what I'd like to do. It's tempting to view both past, present, and future of Detroit through the lens of the Grand Bargain. Because it was such an extraordinary moment in time for a city to sort of reset its table, put its civic infrastructure sort of back in order, municipal infrastructure back in order. But I think, as Joel suggested, in some ways, it ends up not, I think, fully reflecting either how Detroit got to a bankruptcy position that actually could be turned to advantage, nor does it, I think, fully extend out into the sort of the possibilities of a community that is seeking reinvention. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So I thought what I might do, I mean, to the extent that I do know what I'm going to say, what I might do is talk about philanthropic role in Detroit. I could, and we can, I'm happy to do this in the subsequent conversation. We're happy to talk about Detroit as a city, as a study in sort of urban practice all afternoon. But I think I hope the reason you all are here is to talk a little bit about how philanthropy plays into that equation. And so what I thought I'd do is talk about 6 broad roles that philanthropy played leading up to the bankruptcy. Some of you, forgive me, have heard bits and pieces of that story before. But then I'd like to sort of pivot just a bit and try to understand whether those 6 roles look the same or whether they look quite different going forward. Because I think when you have such a major municipal reset, the roles and the responsibilities of all of the sectors kind of get thrown up in the air, and how they kind of land and how they relate one to another, I think, becomes a really interesting case study in sort of the adaptability of philanthropy or the relevance of philanthropy. And so let me try to make that case. I'm going to walk through a set of slides.
Which he drew, incidentally.
Right. The people from Kresge are now cringing because they've seen these, but not these, but different versions. I think what I'll do is pass these out and walk through them. What you'll see is that there are a series of sort of conceptual. Now let me make sure I know how to do this. No, it's not that one.
Lisa,
Oh, I have. And which of these buttons do I push? The arrow. The right arrow. Hey, okay. Good. So as these are coming around, I know how it is with visuals. It's hard to ignore them, but I'm going to take some liberties with them, and I think I'm going to play to the screen if you don't mind. But in case you're interested in the detail or can't read the screen, you'll at least have the pieces of paper in front of you. So Detroit, if we roll back the tape to 2008, 2009, I think it's a familiar story, but let me just put a pin in it. Detroit was essentially the victim of a perfect negative storm. Not only were we susceptible to the same pressures arising from the mortgage foreclosure crisis and from the Great Recession, but we had two other pieces thrown into the stew. The first was a political leadership that turned out to spend most of its time over the next 5 or 6 years in jail. Kwame Kilpatrick was elected as a dynamic, young mayor of the city of Detroit, full of promise. I got to know him pretty well, a brilliant man, but tragically ended up engaging in acts of corruption that essentially destroyed the entire administration. And I can't remember, Tony, I think you noted it's, 40, 50 members of his administration ended up being indicted. So there was a complete and utter collapse of the municipal sector in the same time that we were trying to weather the recession and the foreclosure crisis. And then, as you all may remember, the autos were going into bankruptcy, at least 2 of the 3 of them, and the third was teetering. And so you had a private sector that was completely in the bunker. I mean, just no communication, no civic activity, no charitable activity. You had a public sector that was completely non-functioning. And you had a nonprofit sector that was just hanging on by a thread with sort of no visible means of support. And so it called a question in the philanthropic world of whether we had either the will or the ability to try to step into the void and not substitute for the public sector, not substitute for the private sector, but create some kind of holding mechanisms that would enable us to weather the next 3 or 4 or 5 years until the markets returned, until the public sector sort of regained its sense of public legitimacy and could move forward in a way that any normal city might expect. And it was at that point that Kresge, as well as our partners both locally and nationally, decided that there really was a philanthropic role to be played. I started a conversation in our own organization by creating a drawing that some of the folks here have seen before. It's a 9-part, I won't show it again, a 9-part schematic that's sort of 9 bodies of work ranging from land use to education to healthcare to transportation, trying to understand where I believed we had the capacity as a philanthropic community to actually begin setting something in motion that could take, and that collectively would be of significance. I mean, you can do a lot of small things that make no difference, but if you could actually make progress on transportation reform or on education reform or on any number of other fronts, it might actually constitute the kind of scaffolding that I just described. And so when I've come before, I've sort of walked you all through, or some of you all through those 9 modules. And I thought today I'd sort of slice it differently, which is really this next slide, which suggests 6 ways that we chose to work. And so rather than sort of moving from subject matter to subject matter to subject matter, I thought I would talk a little bit more about how we worked. And then I can retrofit, and we can all retrofit into that frame, how that sort of created the scaffolding pre-bankruptcy, and where I think, as a result of the bankruptcy, those roles might play out going forward. So if you'll indulge me, I think I'm just going to sort of move one by one through them and again, sort of do a before and an after, and then maybe we can, at the end, reflect on whether the after and the sort of the go-forward look represents a fundamentally different approach to working in Detroit, or whether in many ways it's just a continuation and more of the same. I mean, my bias is that it's a little bit of both. That you can't really, at the end of the day, step away from these roles in a place like Detroit, but they morph, they shape shift as a different kind of municipal administration takes hold, as the private sector markets begin to return to the city, and other factors begin to change the calculus. So let me start. I'm sorry, this is just a sort of a prelude. Just a reminder that the reason I'm using the bankruptcy as a pivot is that it is, I think, important to remind ourselves that the bankruptcy was actually three things, not just a single thing. A lot of people think that the bankruptcy was just a way to alleviate long-term debt, and Detroit was struggling under $18 billion of debt that it could not repay. And so that first pillar of adjusting the long-term debt, healthcare obligation, pension obligations, creditor claims, was vitally important to the success of the bankruptcy and became the focus of all of the national news coverage. But the second pillar was equally important, and that was you had to clean up the municipal balance sheet. We were consistently running in the red. There were consistent structural deficits, and part of the charge of the bankruptcy was to put those back into balance. And the whole so-called plan of adjustment that our emergency manager under the bankruptcy scheme pursued was to make sure that those public services actually were in balance, that revenues and costs balanced out, and that the kind of innovation that would position Detroit for the future was in place. But the third piece is really what I'm going to talk about today, which was the insistence of the bankruptcy judge, a judge named Stephen Rhodes, a phenomenally competent bankruptcy judge, insisted that there be in place the building blocks for the long-term return to health of the city. That as much as you could get the debt figured out, get creditors to settle 10 cents on the dollar, restructure retiree health care benefits, all of that, and as much as you could put in temporary balance through cuts or through sort of temporary infusions of new revenues, the public services sector, that unless you were building something for the long term, you wouldn't have the tax base, you wouldn't have the civic talent base, and you wouldn't have the sort of the broad quality of life issues that would enable Detroit to succeed over the long term. And so this scaffolding that I'm going to talk about was really an attempt to take aim at that third pillar. And in fact, that when I was asked by the bankruptcy judge to testify, this is what he asked me to testify. Not about the grand bargain, which was spectacular, because that really related to the first pillar, but it was about the third pillar that he was most interested in. So let me start, maybe. There we go. The first quality, and forgive me for the sort of the simplicity of these. I drew these specifically for Joel. I told him this. It's actually true. And I thought, well, if you're going to have to look at this up on a screen, I'm going to make the drawings really simple, and I'm going to do really big printing. Usually they're teeny little things you can't read. I hand them out, and people are completely frustrated. So this is a shorthand for the ability of philanthropy to take a long-term view, to try to take on issues that are just too difficult, too complex, too long-term for the municipal sector to take on. And we found that in Detroit, those issues were a mile long, that it was just very difficult for the public sector to take on a set of conversations about land use reform, about educational reform, about the diversification of the economy. Just the list was really a difficult list. And in some ways, it's understandable that folks who are turning around every couple of years on an election cycle had a hard time dealing with this. And certainly the private sector, I think, that just doesn't work in this space. And so the example here, and again, what I think I'll do is not take too long talking about the sort of the 2008 to 2013 build, but let me at least give you sort of a sense of it. The issue that we chose to take on here was Detroit's land use patterns. When Mayor Bing succeeded Mayor Kilpatrick in 2009, he came out of the private sector, wasn't someone who had had any political experience whatsoever, had been an auto executive, essentially a steel executive. And he basically announced to the city of Detroit that we were going to shrink the city. We were going to move people to more productive parts of the city, and we were going to kind of shake the whole thing up. It was a complete and utter disaster. As you might imagine, people who have been living in a place for a long time, or even people who haven't, don't like to be told that they're going to be shifted around and their lives played with. And so, to make a very long story short, Kresge stepped forward and said, why don't we try to frame this slightly differently and create a land use frame that thinks about sort of a syncopation strategy, thinks about a strategy in which you sort of double down on things that are strong, your assets along the corridor, your cultural assets, your small business assets, whatever they might be, and then try to think a little bit differently about how to move the negative assets of the city over to the positive side of the ledger, abandoned and blighted properties, underutilized commercial corridors, whatever it might be. And so this is a very long story, but essentially we took the better part of 4 years, took this conversation essentially outside of City Hall, brought in technical expertise from all around the world to help us think about infrastructure or green, blue, stormwater remediation, all sorts of highly complex things, and married that with probably the most robust community engagement process the city has ever seen, perhaps I would argue almost any city has ever seen, where we ended up touching almost 100,000 people through a whole series of devices to try to get community input, and then created space for the top to meet the bottom, and to try to figure out, what is the technical analysis telling folks with ground level wisdom, what is the ground level wisdom telling the technical folks. And the result of all of this was something called the Detroit Future City Plan, which was a blueprint for how you might go about making investments in the long-term restabilization and reconceptualization of the city. And it really did come down to this sort of syncopation strategy. You strengthen what is strong, and you try to, over time, figure out more creative uses for what is weak. So the question then becomes, after you have a municipal government that has essentially adopted the Detroit City framework, after you usher in a new regime, a guy named Mayor Duggan, Mike Duggan, very competent, ran a private sector medical center, knows how to administer, knows how to attract talent, is there still sort of a table-setting role? And I would argue that it is sort of innate to philanthropy that there is. And so what we're, what we are looking at in sort of the next generation, in the post-bankruptcy generation of work, is doing the same thing for early childhood development. The K-12 system in Detroit is just a mess. There's just no polite way of saying it. But one way or another, we will work it through. We will figure out some way, I hope in concert with other communities that have struggled with these issues, to figure it out. But that is not in Kresge's wheelhouse. We don't have the sort of history in K-12 education that the Skillman Foundation does, or that the Ford Foundation does, or others have. And so I think what we want to do is get a start. And so we, with the Kellogg Foundation, are beginning to reset the table by creating a broad-based civic consortium of public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, philanthropic sector folks to figure out what the different dimensions of early childhood could be, everything from new centers, educare centers, to renovation of existing centers, to try to connect informal networks, informal care networks together more effectively, to professional training, whatever the dimensions of an early childhood system are together, because only about 25% of Detroit's kids are now in child care or child development settings that have even the most basic level of quality. It's really, kids are just not prepared to enter kindergarten ready to learn, not developmentally, intellectually, emotionally, or otherwise. So I think this will be a difficult conversation because it implicates the K-12 system. It is not something that is in the wheelhouse of the public sector, even though obviously federal and state issues sort of get implicated through Head Start and through other pre-K Head Start work. I mean, there are a whole series of issues that I think will end up being complex and difficult. And I just think this perhaps is a good example of a function of philanthropy that actually will, in many ways, serves many of the same sort of purposes as it did pre-bankruptcy. The second is an interesting one. This is the idea that philanthropy can help strengthen civic capacity. There was probably no more difficult conversation, other than land use, that we had pre-bankruptcy than, do we have the folks in the right places to get the right things done for recovery? As you can imagine, folks who have worked in a public bureaucracy for a long time or who have worked at the community level for a long time don't like to hear that we don't have civic capacity. So it was a very complicated set of conversations about the sort of the ratcheting up of the complexity of the challenges the community was facing and matching that up against whether we really were equipped to take on those challenges in all dimensions. It wasn't just a capital challenge, it was a personnel challenge, it was a creativity challenge, it was an innovation challenge. And so one of the things that we, as a philanthropic community, and again, particularly Kresge, tried to figure out is, where might we create sort of acupuncture points of intervention that would help bolster capacity in key ways. One was in entrepreneurial infrastructure. Detroit, for years, forever, has been a command and control auto economy. There is very little tradition, particularly in the city itself, of sort of freewheeling entrepreneurship. You get your specs from the autos and you deliver in. And that's not to say there's not creativity, but it's not really entrepreneurship in the way that Boston understands it or Austin understands it. And so we created a fund that's now grown to almost $150 million called the New Economy Initiative, with contributions from Ford and Kresge and Kellogg and the local foundations, to try to create an entrepreneurial infrastructure that would create the kind of supports that would encourage a new level of entrepreneurship in the city. It has been one of, I think, the great success stories of Detroit. I think when you look now at the burgeoning small business development environment in Detroit, it's really quite breathtaking. Similarly, in 2008, 2009, there wasn't a single community development finance agency working in the city of Detroit. We had no capacity to do community-based lending. And so we worked with something called Living Cities, which is a consortium of national banks and foundations, to bring in capital impact from outside, to bolster 2 or 3 of our sort of emerging community development organizations to create some lending capacity. And it was a good example, again, of trying to sort of balance resources inside the city that were kind of looking for outlets to do lending, but just didn't have the technical expertise or, in some cases, the capital to do it. We similarly created something called the Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows, which are cohorts every 2 years of 30 early stage planners, architects, economic development practitioners who want to come to Detroit and spend a couple of years. It's almost like a Teach for America model, where you spend a couple of years, you're assigned to an organization, and can make a real difference. And so we, in our first year, had 700 applicants from all around the world. We were able to choose 30. We've then repeated that. Now we're in our 4th generation of fellows. And of the 100 or so fellows who have come through the program, over 90 are still living and working in the city of Detroit. We match them up in sort of key public agencies, private agencies, nonprofit agencies. Some continue working for those agencies, some move on to other things. It's been a great program. The point here is, I think, that there was a very intentional attempt to try to isolate where we just didn't have the capacity to deliver sort of needed public innovation, and I think it's worked. As you look forward, I think it takes a slightly different form. I think what we're finding is that as we increasingly pivot to the neighborhoods, and I'll talk about that in a moment, that same issue of capacity in neighborhood community development, in neighborhood organizing, in neighborhood block club formation just isn't there. And so I think we're going to end up spending a lot of time trying to figure out how some of these mechanisms that we created pre-bankruptcy translate into a sort of a more neighborhood-focused approach. And I think just as the entrepreneurial infrastructure, I think, served us so well in the pre-bankruptcy years, it was largely concentrated along our central business district in our corridor, our central commercial corridor. And I think the challenge there is then to move small business development, particularly businesses owned by communities of color, into the neighborhoods and try to figure out how do we get the technical support, the capital support, the networking support they need in order to be successful. Here, though, I think is an area in which the role probably will be different because the municipal sector has so dramatically sort of stepped up its game. Mayor Duggan, for example, has hired a planning director named Maurice Cox from Tulane Design Center, one of the really superb planners in all of America. And in less than a year, Cox has built out a 25-person planning department. Well, that probably has implications for how much we need to lean into issues of community-based planning and economic development and heritage preservation and all of the other things that they'll take on. So I think this is one of those times where this role of capacity building may sort of recede, and it may end up becoming something that the public sector and the private sector can increasingly assume more responsibility for. The third role, which I think is sort of classically a philanthropic role, not just in Detroit but anywhere, is to try to peel away the first layer of risk from really important transactions that help signal to the market that you can actually invest in a place. And just two quick examples here. The first is something called the Woodward Corridor Investment Fund. Right in the middle of our downturn, it was really clear that there was just insufficient capital to bridge the gaps in a lot of the transactions that really needed to happen if we were going to build out our residential and our commercial and even some of our light industrial opportunities. We had a dynamo working in the central part of the city called Midtown Inc. They had pipelines of 20 and 30 deals, but they were going and having to source 13, 14, 15 different sources of capital in order to close the smallest of gaps. And so Napoleon's colleague, Kimberly Cornett, put together a relatively simple idea that we would create a $30 million fund, which would be a sort of a one-stop shop for these projects to go, not have to assemble 13 different sources, where Kresge would take sort of the first layer of risk off the table, and we could get actually market loan capital in from other places. And in fact, we got both Prudential and MetLife, neither of whom had ever lent a dime into the city of Detroit, into that deal structure, and it has been just transformative. Sue Mosey, the woman who runs Midtown Inc., has closed more deals in the last 3 years with the Corridor Fund than she had in the previous 15. It is doing exactly what it is told it was intended to do. And again, this notion that you needed philanthropy to sort of take the first layer of risk out of the equation for these banks to enter. An even simpler example is something called the Detroit Grocery Fund, which was an elaborate way to essentially get a Whole Foods into the city of Detroit. We couldn't give money directly to Whole Foods, so we gave money indirectly to Whole Foods. And we created a fund, $1 million fund at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. They went out and said to Whole Foods, we really need fresh food access in the heart of the city, and it needs to be of the highest quality. And Whole Foods said, we can't pencil it out, doesn't work. And they said, well, all right, we have $1 million. Does that help? In fact, it helped. This is a little frustrating a story because, so Whole Foods, to their enormous credit, tweaked their model, made it much more community-based, created a community kitchen in our Eastern market, our big public market, did all sorts of wonderful things. But at the end of the day, they were running a grocery store for profit. And so they, when they opened the Whole Foods in Midtown, they exceeded their first 2 years of revenue projections in the first 3 months. And I just thought, and so we gave them a grant? How about could you pay us back, please? Yeah, so...
the answer was no.
The answer was no. But again, I think an example of trying to make sure that transactions vital to the long-term viability of the city occurred, philanthropy needed to step in.
That's amazing.
I think here we have one of the more interesting pivots. In the post-bankruptcy world, we may well continue to assemble some of these special funds with sort of first risk loss and all that stuff. But in many ways, the market is catching up. The lines of cost and return are beginning to cross. The private sector is beginning to realize that they actually can move into the residential and the commercial markets. People are actually outbidding Dan Gilbert for properties in downtown Detroit. For those of you who have followed that saga, Dan Gilbert, who owns Quicken Loans, now owns 90 properties in the city of Detroit and over 12 million square feet, employing almost 15,000 people. That's a whole nother conversation. And people, I think, for a while just assumed that he was just sort of forcing a market distortion. But in fact, in the last 4 or 5 downtown transactions, he has been outbid by other bidders. Now, that could be a bubble. It could have all sorts of consequences. I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about it. But the point is that I think the sort of the pre-bankruptcy positioning of philanthropic dollars as needing to entice the market in, I think, is receding. And so my intention, my hunch is that where we will have to de-risk going forward is in the much larger, more complex, multi-transactional moves that are represented by sort of a comprehensive community development. Probably the poster child for this is a section of Northwest Detroit where the old, what's called Avenue of Fashion, which is where the African American community for the better part of 50 years did shopping, but has fallen into disinvestment and disrepair, intersects with a couple of our anchor institutions, a couple of educational institutions and medical institutions up in the northwest part of the city. And we just need to sort of do a full landscape intervention with the community to make sure that housing stabilization goes forward, commercial revitalization goes forward, educational upgrades, the location of early childhood space, whatever it may be. But that the market is not ready for. I mean, in many ways, it's analogous to where Woodward in the Central Business District was pre-bankruptcy. This is where the neighborhoods are. And so I think what you're likely to see out of Kresge, and I hope others, is the attempt to create a more comprehensive approach to sort of how we, again, signal to the market that you actually can invest in a neighborhood. But to do it, you're going to have to do sort of multifaceted investment because this stuff is all linked. You can't do the education without the residential, without the transit, without the natural amenities. It's all part of a package. The fourth piece is serving as a guarantor of value. I stole this term from Jeremy Nowak. Some of you may know. So
He spoke here.
Yeah, Jeremy is brilliant. And he basically said to me, he said, you know, as you talk about some of these investments, aren't you really fundamentally serving as a guarantor of value? Aren't you essentially signaling to the private sector that the amenity structures that they have come to expect in other environments exist? And he said, so look at the riverfront. Look at the rail system you're doing. Both of those things are interesting in and of themselves in that you're trying to create a mass transit system for the city or you're trying to open up the front porch of the river. But essentially what you're saying to the Dan Gilberts or to the community as a whole is that these are investable places. These are places that people want to live. These are places your employees want to live. And therefore, you should feel some long-term comfort in investing. And both of these, and I won't go into the details because I think a lot of you have heard them from me, so I apologize. But both of these, I think, were really powerful, emblematic examples of that. The Riverwalk was an industrial wasteland until about 15 years ago. And through the intervention of Kresge, General Motors, and others, we created an elaborate public public-private philanthropic partnership that invested almost $250 million in the reclamation of the riverfront. And it is exactly this sort of value proposition that the Dan Gilberts in the community was looking for. It's filled with a cross-section of Detroit community that is really remarkable to behold. And I think it's only a matter of time before it begins to spin the kind of residential and commercial and recreational development along its spine that we expect. Similarly, the rail project is an attempt by Kresge in a private sector consortium to create the first leg of a regional transit system. Long, complicated story, but essentially Kresge put the first $50 million on the table to build out something that runs from the river into Midtown, that not only links all of the institutions up and down the spine, but begins to build out land use in a way that all light rail, all public transit does if it's done effectively, and more importantly, begins to bridge into a broader system. The pivot here, because neither of these projects is done, but the pivot here, I think, is to understand that these, in many ways, were municipal amenities in a sort of an urban context that just sort of shouts out for regional solutions. You can't build a rail system if part of your purpose is to connect inner city folks to the job centers to the north and to the west. You can't build an amenity structure if all it is just sort of a sort of an isolated amenity to which people kind of come, get out of their cars, walk around, and go away. You have to sort of build a sort of a sense of connectivity to sort of the larger ways that people recreate and spend their time. And so I think here the guarantor of value really comes in these regional systems. And I've just used the transit system as illustrative. So for the better part of 10 years, we've spent putting together the most complicated transaction that Western civilization has ever seen in the rail system. I can't even begin to tell you the federal complexity, state complexity, municipal complexity, philanthropic complexity. But what we now do have, and we'll open, our first car was just delivered a couple weeks ago. What we do have is the nation's first example of a privately and philanthropically planned, and largely privately and philanthropically funded, although we did get public money, mass transit system. But again, it's going to be completely inadequate unless it connects into the larger system. And so what we are now doing, and we're in the middle of, is a referendum among the 4 counties of Southeast Michigan about whether they are willing to pay for the build out of a regional transit system that would use the rail as sort of the backbone of a system, but that would then connect all parts of the region through bus rapid transit, through paratransit, even through next technology transit. It's not clear that we'll be successful. I mean, just as it was not clear that we would be successful with rail. But this is really this is enormously frustrating for a philanthropy because we can't weigh in on the politics of a referendum. We are precluded by the IRS from advocating for a legislative result. And so what we did until it became clear that this was going on the ballot and the language was certified for the ballot is that we just spent a ton of money on public education, just trying to help people understand the importance of transit, the importance of this kind of regional connectivity. But again, I think the sort of notion of will the role change? The role has to change because I think these big infrastructure plays are enormously time-consuming, very expensive, and end up displacing other priorities. So I think that in many ways what we're trying to do is hand off these large public infrastructure plays to the folks who need to own them, which is the public sector. And I'll speed up a little bit, Joel. I'm sorry to keep going.
It's fascinating.
The fifth role was the idea of sort of acting as a seller, sort of trying to help attract resources to a community at the time it needed it the most. That could take the form of trying to convince the Ford Foundation that it ought to come back to Detroit and invest in a more meaningful way. It was a conversation that we had with Luis Urbinez when he came to Ford. As I talked about earlier, it's an attempt to try to attract talent to complement the talent that pre-exists in the community, but to supplement it with new ideas and new skills and new competencies. It was trying to change the narrative from Detroit as just this turn the lights out kind of proposition to a community that actually had hope. But let me just tell a quick story about the Washington connection, because I thought here in that story is perhaps the best example of how philanthropy could help draw resources to the community in a different kind of way. The Obama administration, I don't mean to be political about this, but the Obama administration has been deeply, deeply committed to trying to make Detroit work. Sean Donovan, when he was Secretary of HUD, created the Smart Communities, Smart Cities initiative. He launched it in Detroit. It was based in Detroit. They've been deeply involved in helping us with blight remediation. But the most striking moment came when I got a call from Gene Sperling. Sperling was the domestic economic advisor to the president, and he called right when the bankruptcy was declared and said, Rip, we can't refinance your bonds. We can't push legislation through this Congress to get you more money. But my suspicion is that through some combination of repurposing unspent money and giving you more regulatory latitude to do some of the things you want to do, like on the rail project, we can be helpful. So I want to bring all the cabinet secretaries to Detroit and have a big powwow and see what happens. And I said, please do not do that. Please, that would be just disastrous. It's not the dynamic you want. It's all about sort of the optics of engagement. It has nothing to do with the substance. I said, could you give us 2 weeks? We will prepare a 15-page memorandum on where we believe the sort of the touchdown points of the federal government are, where we perceive there to be some need and some possibility. And then you can take it and run it through your system and see if that's real or not real. So we did. We gave him a 15-page memo. Laura Trudeau of our staff sort of did nothing but that for 3 weeks and touched all of the people locally and nationally we could. Gene then called back and he said, well, that's been very useful. We've actually circulated that to the different agencies of the government, and we'd love to have you come out to Washington under cover of darkness and secrecy. And I said, good, that we can do. And so we got a dozen people who were sort of competent to sort of problem solve around these sort of nodes of interest and possible engagement. And I didn't know what to expect. But we walked into the Roosevelt conference room. It was crazy. There was Valerie Jarrett, Secretary Lew, 8 cabinet secretaries, the head of White House tech. I mean, it was nutty. I mean, Gene had just pulled out all the stops, and it was clear that this was going to be a serious conversation. And so for the next 3 hours, we kind of scrolled through housing, transit, safety. The Attorney General was there. I mean, it was wild. And sort of certified where we thought, based on their best information, they could be helpful. So they then took all of that back. They created interdisciplinary working teams, and this is all with really short order. I mean, we're talking weeks, and not the normal timeline of the feds. They created working teams around these, and they sent us back a proposal.
They sent you a proposal.
Yeah, they sent me back a proposal. They sent me back a proposal that basically said, here is a package that is a combination of regulatory flexibility and hard dollars on the barrel. There are a couple of places where we just need to see some philanthropic money in the game. Would you be willing to do that? And when I got to the bottom line, it was a $300 million package. It was unbelievable. It was repurposing blight monies. It was finding transit monies that hadn't been spent and permitting them to be used for bus repair. It was vests for the police department that the Attorney General had found in some unused fund. It was just remarkable. And so Knight, Ford, Kresge, and a couple of others came up with some additional money to sort of fill the gaps, and we essentially were able to move that money directly into the water system of municipal government. And it was just a profound assist. And I'm sorry that the story is so long, but it seems to me that that's a really interesting philanthropic role, is that we just sort of bridged. You know, the feds did all of the hard work. They were the ones who found the money, but we were able to, I think, have enough ground truth under our belts to be able to say, let us serve as your Sherpas. Let us sort of identify where you might move, where there might be some hazard points, and it was brilliant. I mean, they were truly extraordinary.
But it was your credibility, actually, that both got them to do this. And because you'd been working at these things for years before you went to them. Obama was elected in 2008, right?
Right.
And you had been there already doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, in a sense, you had a track record of
well, and I think it was because we had a track record that Gene felt he could call. I mean, you know, I think he knew at that point that the mayor was just coming on, new mayor was just coming on board. That was sort of iffy. We were still in a bankruptcy. It had to be sort of quiet. You know, the minute this blew up, the creditors would be, you know, landing on, it had to be done in a less than transparent way. I'm not proud of that, but I don't think we had an alternative. But as I look forward, and I don't mean to prolong this piece, but I think in some ways, trying to open conversations with the rest of the American urban environment, with other cities, is a really interesting exercise. And it's something that we've begun. We've started something called the American Cities Practice, which essentially tries to say, are there things that we have done, we've tried, we've learned, that may or may not have application to other places? And in some ways, it's not as sort of, it's not an unselfish act, because what we've begun is a whole suite of conversations with communities around the country that essentially sort of opens the conversation in both directions. Because when you talk to Charlotte about something they found interesting in how we promoted small business, all of a sudden they've done it a little differently, and they, you know, push back at you. And I think what we're developing, I think, is a really interesting sort of introduction of Detroit into the national urban conversation. And I think that's helpful to other cities, and I think it's helpful to Detroit. And so again, this is, I think, a place where this acting as a seller is less to get money into Detroit. I think we've done that. We've done the best we can on that, and now the markets and the public sector are sort of handling that. But what I think is interesting is using your ability to sort of act as a, not so much a seller here, but this is more of an act as a translator to sort of begin a different kind of conversation.
It's fantastic. But what's absent, when I look at this, I say, what's absent? What's absent is the role of the states. And you know, I don't know what happened with respect to Michigan and all of this with respect to Detroit. Maybe not much. I mean, I know they did come in part in the bankruptcy, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but my sense is that it does leave out the states, and you know, there's many states have tried to do things like this, some with more and some with less success. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering if this, I don't want to make your drawings more complicated, but
yeah, no, it's a very good question.
But
yeah, it is a good question. Let me just do the last slide and use that as a sort of an introduction to this, because
okay,
I think,
sure.
And this is the last slide. I apologize if this has taken quite so long.
No, they're all beautiful slides. They're a lot more comprehensible than some of the earlier ones.
Well, I must admit, if you have any desire whatsoever, that table setting drawing, I think actually the pinnacle of my career was when I figured out how to draw a diaper. I had to draw the early childhood system, so diapers were just befuddling to me. I didn't know how to do that. So this is the last one, and that is not to take one's eye off of the basic charitable impulse of trying to make sure that you attend to the fragile ecologies of a place, whether that's safety net services, whether it's other kinds of activities that at the end of the day simply aren't market driven. They just aren't. And we spent an enormous amount of time and energy and political capital trying to build out this ecology in the pre-bankruptcy era of the Detroit arts and cultural ecology. I think, again, it is one of the sort of the defining characteristics of Detroit's resurgence. You not only have the houses on the hill, the opera and the symphony and the DIA, but you have this entire ecology that in many ways had been neglected pre-2008. There really wasn't an ecology. There were bits and pieces of it in Detroit, but there was no support going to individual artists. There were no support going to these sort of fledgling organizations in community that were trying to get up and going, and even the ones that sort of occupied the garden, sort of the more cultivated ones like the Charles Wright African American Museum or others, just really were starved for capital. And I think we've taken, as a philanthropic community, a real run at making sure that that ecology is balanced and vital and robust, and underneath it we've done a whole suite of things that sort of prop the whole thing up. But as you turn forward, I think this in many ways will continue. We're in the game of trying to promote arts and culture over the long term as both a community building tool and also as sort of an expression of community creativity and voice. But as you look forward, there are a couple of other ecologies that really need tending. One is the human development system. The supports that people need, whether it's job training, food shelves, domestic violence centers, whatever it is really very poorly built out in the city. And I think this is going to be something that we all turn to in a more substantial way. And we're blessed in Detroit with the oldest and largest public market in America, the Eastern Market. And it's a phenomenal 1 mile square complex of retail and commercial, and it's wild. And so the idea of trying to create a more vibrant food ecology that pulls on all of the community gardening and other activities that sort of swirl around the city of Detroit is very exciting. So those are the six roles. And I think, Joel, to your point, the rebalancing that has gone on, I think, has in many ways left the state out. What we've seen is a public sector that's far more responsive, far more competent, and I think increasingly comfortable with this more distributive leadership model. Right. That philanthropy will take a piece, or the private sector will take a piece, or the civic community will take a piece. But I think we have in state government a partner that doesn't know what to do with that. Right. They just, they're still in categorical aid programs. They still have to spread their work across the state. They get very uncomfortable saying, well, yeah, we'll do something special in Detroit. They just are almost constitutionally incapable of that. And Governor Snyder, Rick Snyder, who I think for the most part of his 2 terms has been a really good governor. Flint has made this a little bit more complicated, but the first 6 years, I think he really tried to pay attention to urban areas. But again, he would say, well, I can't really do Detroit. I've got to do Detroit and Flint and Grand Rapids. And all of a sudden, it just sort of collapses of its weight. Because this is ultimately about context. It's ultimately about understanding what's going on in a place and tailoring your interventions to a place. And so I don't know, people in the audience may have a better take on this, but I think it is a big hole in the drawings.
Well, it may be a hole, but what you've done is so much larger than the whole. I mean, this is really, I think, just the conceptualization of this and the practicality of it really strike me as being very, very encouraging. But now let's hear from you all. Questions, comments, Sonny?